Welcome to the VOPCast, brought to you by Banfico. In this series, we explore the key challenges and opportunities in staying compliant with the upcoming instant payment regulation, with a special focus on verification of payee and how banks can go beyond compliance to proactively reduce fraud, protect their customers, and build trust.
Hello everyone and welcome to a new episode of the VOPCast series. My name is Vasile Valcov. I'm a business development consultant with Banfico, and I'm very happy to host today's discussion and have as a guest Ralf Ohlhausen, who's the chair of the European Third-Party Provider Association. Welcome, Ralf.
Hello.
We know by now with the upcoming mandate of October 2025, when financial institutions and payment service providers have to comply with the requirements in the instant payment regulations. We know that a lot of banks are actively preparing for it, and many of the players are aware about this regulation. But we have observed that we have other players under PSD2, mainly the payment initiation service providers, and not all of them are aware that this mandate is also applicable to them. Can you please tell us and give us a high-level overview of the requirements when we talk about PISPs?
Yes. Well, just one word on the history. So, of course, from a PI's open banking or PISP perspective, it has been one of the problems with PSD2 relying on non-instant payments and the risk there is that they may not get executed. So we've been, and our organization, been quite instrumental in pushing for this regulation to be mandated so that instant payments can actually become the basis for making European payments great again and providing European alternatives to the cards and wallets from the East and West. So with that, and when that then came on board and we saw that the VOP was built into that regulation, well, we had to explain that from an open banking perspective, it does not make sense to have this VOP done if you're acting on behalf of the PE. So the classic PISP, which is allowing merchants to get paid via open banking. So these classic PISPs, I like to call them merchant-sided or payee-sided PISPs, they are actually putting the data, the payload or the payment details into the initiation, because it's not the payer who is creating that. It's actually the main purpose of that PISP, that it is creating the form of basically filling in automatically the form for the payer so that this data, the merchant name and the merchant IBAN, is provided by the PISP himself. And of course, previously obtained from the merchant and in a KYC process that you usually do. So with that in mind, we have said that, well, if the payer is not providing the data, and especially if it's a PISP doing it, there is no point in doing a transactional VOP because it got to be right by definition. Thankfully, that was added into the regulation. So we had this exemption, let's call it, which is in this Article 5 C paragraph 2, that if a PISP is basically acting here, then there is no VOP required, at least not as part of the transaction. But there are still, of course, a few question marks around when and how that exactly applies, and also more importantly, well, what happens if the PISP is not acting on behalf of the payee, but acting on behalf of the payer. It's a more rare, it's a more newer use case. It's typically actually coming out of AISPs, account information service providers, which are, providing account information, but then also maybe want to help the customer to move money from one of their account to another one of their account, and therefore also become a PISP and then in this case, of course, act on behalf of the payer and moving money from one of their accounts to someone else, or paying a bill, or even to a third party. So there are these use cases as well.
So from the regulations perspective, we can clearly separate between two major scenarios or use cases. One is when the payment is initiated on behalf of the payee, and that's what we call a merchant use case. And these are online merchants that want to get paid through open banking rails. And I've seen firsthand that there's quite a big push from larger merchants that want to benefit from the open banking rails, right? To be able to get paid faster in a more secure way, but also to pay less in commissions by not using the traditional payment methods that we have on the market. And one of the main issues has always been the lack of instant payments if they want to use the SEPA rails. And then we've seen countries where instant payments was available when open banking launched, like the UK, like the Netherlands, where these merchant use cases have become quickly very successful, and the adoption is increasing, every month, and we see millions and billions of money being transferred through open banking rails. And the second one is all the other use cases when the payment initiation service provider doesn't have the details to initiate that payment order. And but we'll cover that as well. What I wanted to suggest maybe is to go a bit in more details about the first use case and highlight the importance of the KYC that you mentioned. Why it is important for the KYC to happen in that way, so that the payment initiation service providers don't have to do the VOP checks later on when transactions are being initiated. And to do that and also help our viewers, I'm gonna share a scheme. So this is when the PISPs are acting on behalf of the payee, and basically we have two processes here. The first one is when the PISP is onboarding the merchant, and when they need to get the details, the account details, and verify that those account details are correct and they belong to that merchant. What are your thoughts here?
Yeah, so maybe important to understand because this is linked to the AML regulation, or actually currently the anti-money laundering directive, which is still in place, but in the last few years we have agreed a new regulation to become effective. I think it's still another 2 years or so until it does, but in both cases the PISP has an obligation to know their customer, which in this case is the payee. Part of that will be a due diligence process, which means that in most cases, and at least that's how I've done in the past, typically you ask the merchant for a copy of their bank statement. So that's one critical piece of information or data that you would have. And with that, you obviously have the information of the IBAN on that statement and also the actual account holder name for that IBAN. So you are having the exact match of the IBAN and the account holder name, which is what this VOP is for. And therefore, that's what you obtain in this onboarding process. And then that is the data that the PISP will then be using here in the second step. So where, say, a customer is, doing shopping on this merchant's website and then selecting a PISP in the checkout process. And then in this step 2 or 3, it is the PISP will initiate that payment, but will put forward through the PSD2 API the IBAN of the payee, so the IBAN of the merchant, and the recipient name, so the account holder name of the merchant, which by definition will match. And therefore, what's here depicted as like a voluntary step 2 is not really necessary. So there might be occasions where you got to do it. And maybe I should say that, this onboarding process is not just a one-off thing. So the AML regulation, also the directive, they are stipulating refreshed views on that. So you got to do that at some frequency. You got to check again. So you can't just keep that assume validity forever. So you need what's called a robust process to make sure that the data is correct and stays correct. And if you have that, then in this case, this step 2 on the lower part of the picture is typically not necessary, because the data that you put into the payload will be correct by definition. That's for the initiation. But then the customer has to authorize the execution. So for the execution part of the payment, which is an activity that happens between the payer and their bank, so the payer's ASPSP, whilst actually the initiation part there is handled between the payee and the PISP, but the execution is handled between the payer and the payer's bank ASPSP here. So there you have the authorization of the payment, which is typically done via SCA, and which then leads to the actual execution in step 5. And where it says here in step 4, VOP check may be, that is, of course, not desired. So from a PISP's perspective, I just explained why there is no need for a VOP check for that transaction. So we don't want the payer's ASPSP to do that VOP check in this use case. But I think that's also still one of the open questions on how to make sure that that is avoided.
Yeah, and it's nice of you to mention it because it's one of the topics we wanted to discuss today with you. You obviously talk to a lot of the players in the industry, to banks, to open banking vendors, to regulators. What's your view on how banks want to interpret this side of the table? Do they want to do VOP checks for their PISP channel?
Yes. Well, we have discussed this for quite some time. I think this goes back, since the start of the IPR, and we've had especially discussions on that at the Berlin Group level. So we've looked at the situation here, and it became very clear very early that many banks, if not most banks, actually have an interest to do these VOP themselves, rather than relying on a PISP doing it. From a bank's perspective, it is understood that many of them prefer to just do the VOP themselves. And to be fair, it was also from a PISP's perspective, maybe not for this case, where obviously we don't want that VOP because we know it's not needed, but we'll come back to that for the payer case in a minute, where there is a need for a transactional VOP. Most PISPs will probably be happy if that is done by the bank and not to be done by the PISP. Therefore, we had agreed, and the Berlin Group implemented into their standard into the possibility of a flag. It's called a client VOP requested. So it's a flag that the API client, so the TPP, could say, please do the VOP for me, or not. Don't do it for me. And depending on that, we would then have a clear request. We would have a clear also shift of liability, responsibility, and liability would be very, very clear. It would be basically a win-win between banks and TPPs on how to organize this. So we were glad that Berlin Group implemented that into their standard. But then unfortunately, in the meantime, IPR, so the Instant Payments Regulation, was enacted, and we couldn't convince the regulator that this win-win would be in everyone's interest. So the regulation, and especially then the clarification on the regulation, these Q&As that have come out, there's one of them which made it then pretty clear that, in a case where this exemption here doesn't apply, and where the PISP is not acting on behalf of the payee, but acting on behalf of the payer, they will have to do it themselves, and they cannot offload it. We have the possibility in the standard. Now, I'm not sure how many banks will actually implement it because it's not mandatory, following what I just said. So FISMA didn't want to do that. And so now we have a bit of an unclear situation.
Moving forward, we said that the second big use case and scenario is when the payment initiation service provider acts on behalf of the payer. And I'll quickly change the picture. And it's a much more simple scheme, luckily. So one of the examples that you mentioned, I think, is P2P transfers. So let's imagine an app or a platform that has users and they want to get paid, transfer money for whatever reasons. And that is being done through open banking rails. In that case, the user would be the payer that enters the details of the payee, of the other person they want to pay. And in this case, we said the regulation mandates that the payment initiation service providers have to do a VOP check. So for payment initiation service providers, additional regulatory burden, I would say, but also necessary in order to fight fraud and provide this trust framework for people to be able to make these payments in a safe way. What does a payment initiation service provider have to do in order to be able to provide these VOP services?
Yeah, so here in this case, where you're acting on behalf of the payer, it's not the payer entering the detail but into the transaction. It's still the PISP, but it's giving it to the PISP. The PISP obtained it from the payer, not from the payee. Therefore, you are not sure. You don't know the payee. You don't know the payee IBAN matching with their account holder name, etc. So you need to do the VOP check for each individual transaction of this kind. So that's step 2 here. So we have to do the VOP check. In order to do a VOP check, you have to adhere to the VOP scheme of the EPC. There is, in order to adhere to that, there are some prerequisites. So for starters, you have to obtain a BIC that I think many PISPs won't have because they never needed it in the past. So you have to obtain a BIC, which is a bit of an overhead. And then in order to, if you don't have one yet, in order to get the BIC, you also have to obtain an LEI first nowadays. So you have to get that as well. And when you have all that, then you can join that VOP scheme, or well, you maybe more advisable, you use an RVM, a routing and verification mechanism such as Banfico to work for you and to act on your behalf within the EPC scheme, and then also do the VOP check for you, etc. So, because otherwise you have to build an infrastructure, you have to connect to all the different parties on the other side. So there is obviously a lot involved, and I'm sure you cover that in other VOPcasts here as well on what that means. So this is a huge thing, and that's also why I think many PISPs thought, okay, well, no, we don't want to do that. So we would rather have a flag where we ask the bank to do it for us, and then they would be out of the picture. But, well, sorry, no. The regulation says differently, and in particular, Q&A number 135 makes it very clear that the PISP has to do this VOP check directly. So got to be part of the scheme, do this VOP check for this use case. And then when you do it, well, after you've done that, then you can submit the payment instruction here, or initiate the payment, in this case on behalf of the payer. And then the payment, well, obviously the payer still has to now authorize the execution. So step 4 is necessary. But then the bank, the payer's bank, should do the execution, step 5, and that's good. What we definitely do not want is that the bank is now doing another VOP at that point, which there is a risk of happening. And so now going forward, we'll have to find a way to avoid that there is any double VOP done in this case.
Thank you, Ralf. And thanks for everyone for tuning in. We will continue the series, so wait for updates from our team and join the next discussion with our next guests. Have a good day, everyone. Bye-bye.
Thank you for watching this episode of the VOPcast. For more information or to schedule a demo, contact our experts at vop@banfico.com. Don't miss the next episode. We'll be back with more insights to help you meet the October deadline.